Alrighty then. Is this thing even working? Cool. What's up everybody, this is Ryan here and you're watching episode number 79 of my live stream Q&A. So no big plans to talk about anything in particular. I do have something I'll ramble about if questions are non-existent today. But other than that, I was going to try and just focus on taking as many viewer questions as possible. In the next live stream, so a couple announcements for the next live stream, which is number 80. If you've been watching my live stream for any significant period of time, then you'll know that on the basically every 10th episode, so 60, 70, 80. I'm sure I had to explain that to you, didn't I? That was a joke. Every 10th episode, I basically do a non-technical Q&A. Now, what I mean by non-technical is very often during my live stream, I'll get bombarded with some really hyper-specific technical questions about APIs and things like that. And so while I do my best to answer those questions when I'm familiar with the API or if there's anything useful I feel I can say about it, I'll try to. But it also gets kind of, I do get to the point where I feel like I kind of want to not only answer or help people figure out how to use Dagger 2 and stuff like that. So anyways, for the next live stream, which will be hopefully next Sunday, possibly next Monday, we shall see. I had to pick up some extra work, which is totally fine, but it's going to make my schedule a little bit more random. But yeah, on that episode, what I thought I would talk about is I thought I would basically spend a bunch of time discussing the production side of what I do here with the wiseAss channel. So what I mean by production is what kind of tools do I use for video editing? What kind of best practices do I cover for search engine optimization? And you know, I'm getting a lot better at that, but admittedly I've never been I've always kind of focused more on learning code than learning search engine optimization, but it's definitely something I've been trying to improve and work on lately. And so yeah, that'll basically be it, and then it'll be like kind of just off-topic questions, whatever the hell people want to ask me. Then of course after that it'll be back to the usual technical programming Q&A. So I see we got Konstantinos joining us. So what's up, buddy? I'm Konstantinos. Asks how's it going? It's going good. It's going good. Not too sure what I'm going to be talking about today, but yeah, things are quite all right. So yeah, excited for next live stream, but of course we have to get through this one first. So if you end up learning something today, please do consider hitting the like button down below. And also, if you're here because you've been watching my tutorials or something like that, I just want to mention that I do have a course on Kotlin and application programming fundamentals. So just a quick note about that. So link in the description box if you want to pick it up, blah, blah, blah. Just a note about that. So how the course works currently is that you can do the course entirely in your browser because I don't actually cover Android specific content in the course currently. So I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'm super excited because I have managed to get the course to the front page of search results, and also I recently was given the a highest rated label for my course, which was really 9 out of 11 reviews. I think the average is 4.63 out of 5. So very happy with that. But what I was thinking is the problem with doing the entire course kind of in the browser is that I really can't basically get into any kind of Android content. And what I thought I would do is I've got the option of either making a beginner Android course and a more advanced Android course, or what I could do, and then also the Kotlin course is the basis for the beginner Android course, or what I could do is I was kind of thinking maybe I should just add in some Android content to the Beginner Kotlin course so that I can teach not only the basics of Kotlin, but then also the basics of working with Android, and hopefully also I'll throw in some stuff about web development as well, because that's something I'll be looking into shortly. But I'm really strongly considering doing that, so we'll see how that goes. Anyways, that's pretty much it for my announcements, I think. So yeah, that's basically it. So I'll just ask everyone. So this is a Q&A. So if you have any questions, if you're a beginner or your English isn't great or anything like that, don't worry, just ask your question. I won't judge you, I won't make you feel bad, as long as I can understand the question, and even then I still will try not to make you feel bad. But yeah, I see we got a couple viewers, so let's get some questions going. How are you doing, Konstantinos? Thank you for joining me. So until we get some questions going, I'm just going to rearrange my windows here a little bit. And there is one topic I thought I would kind of ramble about in the meantime. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my windows. All right, so what I thought I would talk about, so I literally like 10 minutes ago just uploaded a new segment for my 2019 Android tutorial. And in the video, which took a hell of a long time to edit as well, it's like a 30-minute video and it had something like 25 different segments. In that video, I covered basically how I approach the Recyclerview nowadays. And so for those of you who are familiar with the earliest videos on this channel, and I actually kind of hope you aren't, because they're pretty crappy, because, well, 3 years ago I just wasn't as good of a developer as I am now. But back then, the first tutorial I ever made was on the Recyclerview. So there was a couple things about it, particularly for the Recyclerview. When I first made it, I basically nested it in the fragment which hosted it. So you would have seen the adapter, the actual adapter class itself within the fragment. And there's actually a pretty high chance that the way I built it in those early tutorials probably had memory leaks and wasn't the most efficient thing. Now, part of that is that the Recyclerview API back then just wasn't as good, and the explanations of how to use it weren't around. I was one of the first people, I would say probably the third person, to actually cover it in like an in-depth tutorial, maybe the second person. And so there just, like I say, there just really wasn't great resources on it. So anyways, when I did this tutorial, there were a couple of things that I remember I was kind of confused about. In just really specific implementation details. So one of the things that I was always kind of confused about, and this kind of confused me when it came to fragments as well, is that whenever we're working with this layout inflator type deal, we have this strange option, this strange Boolean when we call our inflate method, attached to root. And all the tutorials that I looked at, they all said false. All the code I looked at, I only watched one other tutorial on it. And I was just kind of wondering, like, why should this be false? Now, way back then, the only tool I kind of had for actually like figuring out, you know, why something is in terms of like Android source code or Android APIs was to basically just Google it. Now, more recently in the past year, what I've tried to get into the habit of doing is, instead of relying on like Stack Overflow or Google or something like that, or other people to explain it to me, I'm trying to do a better job of actually just diving into the source code of these different classes and checking it out from there, and then seeing exactly in detail what exactly does attach to root do when it's set to false or true. So the thing about this is what I'm talking about here, I don't actually care. The lesson here is not actually about layout inflator. What I'm really talking about here is that when it comes to different Android APIs, so we're talking view model, we're talking live data, we're talking room, we're talking these different classes, a lot of you may not be aware, and I wasn't for like the first 3 years of doing Android, that you can actually look up the source code for these classes. So in particular, I think I had to actually find it in the browser, but I'm going to try and locate the layout inflator source code. So I'm going to hit Control N twice, and that's going to take this option, include non-project items here. And then I'm going to type layout inflator. Now I think there's like I think I had trouble finding the actual implementation of it. I believe this is just like a, abstract class. So I'm not sure. I might have to pull up the implementation class in a browser. But to be honest, it's not even that important. Let me just pull this class up in the Google, and we'll kind of go over it really quickly. So again, the point of this isn't actually to teach you about layout inflator. It's just to show the process of actually looking at the source code of these different Android classes to figure out what exactly is going on. So I'm going to type in the browser layout inflator source code, and hopefully this is the class I want. We got the abstract class. All right, well, this will do. So so here's kind of the thought process here, and this is really what I'm trying to teach here. It's not about layout inflator, like I say. So I've got this parameter of a function that I call all of the time. We use layout inflators all of the time if we're using fragments, Recyclerviews, all kinds of stuff like that. And I don't know what is going on with this kind of cryptic argument here, attached to root false, because when I read this on face value, it almost seems like we're saying that we're telling it not to attach the view to the view hierarchy. Now that is actually what's going on here, but there's there's a reason for this, and the reason is actually kind of confusing. So let's find this inflate function. Hopefully, I guess Control F isn't actually going to help me very much here. Here we go. So inflate. So one of these functions is going to be the one I'm looking for, not that one. We're looking for one with a Boolean. Here we go. So this is the one we're using. So we give it a resource. We give it a view group root. I hear seagulls making a whole bunch of noise outside. Sorry about that. So I'll just zoom in here so you can see what I'm doing. So here we go. This is the actual function that we're calling in the code. This is the wrong project. This is the one I want. So inflator.inflate, and we're passing in false. So I want to know what exactly is going on with this attached to root thing. So I'm not going to ramble about this much longer at all, but let's actually see. Okay, so if I'm following along, this is the function that we called. So we have this resources object. Okay, not super important. And then we have this try inflate pre-compiled. So that's where I'm going to want to jump to next. And it looks like that's popping up down here. All right. So ultimately, next we're calling this function, except now it has a resources or res object created from the context. And here's, I believe, where the magic happens if I've located the correct thing. Here we go. Okay, so what I'm looking for is I'm trying to see, okay, when exactly does this Boolean attached to root actually get used? And it only gets used way down here. So if attached to root.addView, so root is actually this layout that we're passing in here, container. So it's not the layout of the item that we're inflating. It's the layout of this view group container. And this thing is actually coming from the implementation of the Recyclerview. So we don't really control that directly. So all this attached to root thing does after looking at it is Yeah, well, I guess it does exactly what I thought initially. So it just calls this add view function, which should be a function of view group, and then it's going to add, of course, the view, which should be the view holder object, and or at least the view that the view holder object represents, and then some params. So that just comes from, these are just like layout parameters. Don't worry about that. Otherwise, we don't call root.addView. We just set some layout params on the view. So what do we know here? So attached to root really does mean that if we have it set to true, then we're adding the adding this inflated layout to the root hierarchy of the container. So here's kind of the problem. And so this is why inflator was kind of a bad example. So when it turns out, when would you not want to actually, when would you want to say attached to root true? And this is where it gets kind of confusing. So because internally, and I didn't have time to look up exactly where, but because internally the adapter, the Recyclerview adapter, actually will add the view holder to the appropriate layout hierarchy on its own time, it's actually controlling that, we say attached to root false. So what ultimately is going to happen is at some point, some aspect of the recycler view is going to find some view to add the inflated layout to. So in a situation where you have direct control, you're working with a class which isn't going to do that for you, that's when you would want to have attached to root set to true. So anyways, it's kind of an annoying example. It's kind of ambiguous, but what I wanted to show you there in this particular case is, and it works better with other examples. Like I wasn't actually able to pull up the layout inflator code in this particular class, but the main thing I want to get across here is when you want to actually like figure out, kind of deep dive into source code, do your best to actually find the real source code of the class, and don't be afraid to jump in there and actually look at it. Like when I was working with and trying to figure out how coroutines worked, I actually cloned the, it's like Kotlin X coroutines library, and spent, quite a few hours kind of pouring through that particular source code to try and figure out what it actually means, say, when we add the suspend modifier to a function in Kotlin. And then from there, instead of having to actually like rely on other people's explanation of what it does, I can actually see, okay, when I add the suspend keyword to just some function, it adds a continuation object. And then I have to go and figure out, okay, what is a continuation object? And then I find several other topics that I need to learn after that. But that's how I actually go about pouring through this code and trying to understand how it works, not in someone else's words, but by learning it and knowing it in the code itself. So hopefully that little rambling was kind of useful. So I see we have a question. All right. So Konstantinos is asking, okay, in my app I have to track user location every 5 minutes. Have I ever built something like that? I found something called Location Manager. Okay, so it's been a while, Konstantinos, but I do have some information on this. Just making sure I'm spelling your name correctly. I'm just, here, I'll just copy and paste it in because you have pretty clear question. Okay, so Konstantinos is asking, so in my app I have to track the user location every 5 minutes. Have you ever built something like that? I found something called Location Manager. So I did work with Location Manager in the past. So that is how I would go about doing that. So the trick here, I'm trying to think if there's any practical advice I can offer. Let me see if I can pull up the source code for that. Come on, brain, you can do this. What's my GitHub bracket cove? I think it's Java code too, so it's really old code. But we can maybe get an idea of the functions. Okay. Main. Sorry, this could just take a moment. Pretty sure this project has that. Yelp. Database, that's not it. Okay, which friggin'... Sorry, this could take a moment here. I'm trying to figure out which class actually has the... Is it util? No? Sorry, this could end up taking just a moment here. Okay, so... Restaurants... No, that's not the one. I can't actually... I'd take you through what I'm looking at on screen, but I can't actually show you all of the code in this project, unfortunately. It's actually a private project, so I have to be very picky. Okay, I'm getting closer. We are getting closer to the answer. Restaurant source. Oh, I think I know what's going on. Oh, okay, so I think what's happening here is back then I did this different style of package structures where I put the implementations of my data classes in a separate package. So I think that's probably what's going on here. Okay, auth, Yelp service. Okay, so just be forewarned here. So this is old ass code, and it is what it is. But the question, so how I did this before is, and I don't actually recommend you do this exactly like this. I would pull this location object into a separate service. This code is back in 2016, and I was, that's 3 years of programming experience that I am behind in back then. But I think what I did is, so I used location, where was the thing? I'm not sure if I'll even be able to give you a good answer here at this point, because I don't remember how this code works. But was it the location API, I think? Yeah, Android location. And where do I use it? Oh, I created this thing called a location util. And that's how I got a hold of it. So where is location util? Okay. This is totally... Okay, here we go. I think this is the thing that I'm looking for. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so how this friggin' location util thing works, and again, like, we're just kind of almost going over this for fun, because this is, like, pretty messed up code. But, so I use this Google API client thing in this location object. And so I think the, yeah, I basically, yeah, so I basically would just call this getLastKnownLocation function. And so that would, we have a location object, and then whenever I want, after it's initialized, I think we just request the location. I don't know, I'm going to actually just stop answering this question here because I can't even really recommend this code to anyone, but hopefully that was at least funny. So, yeah, so Konstantinos, kind of follows up here. So he just wanted to understand what the purpose of a service in Android is. So a couple of things. So we have to be kind of careful. So there is like the service class in Android, which is kind of a different animal. But my general kind of the way I treat things like sensors, so media players and location service and stuff like that, is I still basically treat them as part of the backend, like sort of an I/O device. So I'll try to pull them out into some kind of backend data source. And that can be a little bit tricky because generally speaking, they'll need context to be initialized. And then, so in whatever, say, use case or interactor or that kind of thing, when you need to keep requesting the location, then basically it's all set up and ready to go. Anyways, I don't have any code to show you on that, so I'm going to have to just leave that question there. So what's up, Mr. Growhick? See, this is what I was talking about, about the technical questions, which is fine. I do try to answer the technical questions as best I can, but the main thing is that I can't really work with them, or I can't really answer them unless I have recently worked with them and I've got some good code. Mr. Hoon is asking, is asking about broadcast receiver. So that's kind of a similar deal with Android service. Off the top of my head, I can't explain to you exactly what the difference is. But when would you want to be working with broadcast receiver or services? These are basically like lower level framework classes that allow you to do things like basically publish data. So generally speaking, when you're working with Android and you want to get data to different parts of your application, how you can kind of do that in a very simple way is to use activity, and then you pass the data through intents. Whereas there's other options in the framework for basically publishing data to not just from your application, not just between different parts of your application, but also you can be publishing data between applications. This is like known as inter-process communication. So again, I don't have code to show you on broadcast receiver or service because I haven't yet implemented that. I haven't yet had a need to, although I think I will be rewriting my POS trainer application and using the service class for my alarm manager. It's one of these things where I managed to basically get through or build the apps that I wanted to build by not actually working with things like executor and handler, service, and broadcast receiver. So what I mean by that is I would use like RxJava or coroutines for threading and asynchrony and stuff like that. And the way that I dealt with working with these different classes was to basically like, let's say I was working with the location service, I would just wrap that in my own class and talk to it like something in the back end. So a more lower level approach, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with doing that, would be to start using things like the Android service class. So anyways, I am not exactly qualified to teach that. So it's not that it's more complicated, it's just that I literally haven't taken the time to go through it. We could have a look now though, since we're out of questions. Yeah, broadcast receiver. This is just going to be the stubs. I'm not sure how much of this code we'll actually be able to see. Yeah. Oh, okay. Google API, is that the one? Oh, that's some ugly code. Anyways, let's we'll look into that another time. I see I have a question which I can actually feel comfortable answering. So, Paul asks, so is it okay to make only one activity on my project with lots of fragments? Okay, so a couple things about that. Where a lot of developers are moving to is to have as few activities as possible in your application. So the thing which a lot of people who are really pushing the single activity approach, is that there are actually cases where you can't have just one activity, or at least the cost to benefit of doing so is it's actually just easier. Sorry, I'm getting a message from YouTube about my stream. Oh, it's just the usual. Your stream is my bandwidth is too low apparently. Whatever. So as I was saying, you should try to do single activity if you can, and one of the ways you can do that, so I'll just start writing stuff down. So number one, to answer the question directly, yes, it's okay, but understand that sometimes you can't use just one activity. So what exactly do I mean by that? Let me give you a direct example. So, and anyways, just one key thing here. If you want to do single activity, check out my navigation tutorial from my Android 2019 tutorial series. So I have a great big video that's very in-depth on the navigation tutorial, and this will show you how to set up what approaches a single activity. Now here's the kicker, the thing that I was saying before. I actually tried to make this project, Jetpack Notes, which is what that big tutorial is based on, single activity. I was not able to, and the reason for that is despite all the hype about the navigation library, it is not integrated with onActivityResult. So in order to actually have my sign-in flow for Firebase and Google Sign-In Client, I had to create a separate activity for that particular feature of the application. Now the other feature of the application, we have just one single activity, and then it's hosting 2 different fragments, and it could basically host as many fragments as I wanted. But that's just kind of an important thing. So I want to kind of address the question here. Why are people actually encouraging single activity? Well, from square one, to be honest, yeah, you can build your applications just using activities and doing like the God activity thing, but that was never recommended, and really as early as, I would say, 2016, at least, I figured this out and learned from other people, that you should basically use your activities like a container object. Now, container is a technical term. If you look it up in computer science, it's basically the environment in which your program is deployed in. So on the Android application, on the Android operating system, we have an application class, which is like an application level container. And then we have our activities. So we've got maybe a couple activities, how we used to do it. And those things are containers for each feature of your application, each primary UI screen. So the end result of that is that we had, and this is how I've been building Android applications for years, is that basically the only thing the activities do, let me jump into code here, is that since the activity has a hook to the fragment manager, they create the fragment manager, get it sort of set in motion, and then at that point, that's all the activity does. So we're not, managing our view hierarchy. We're not responding to click events. We don't have anything going on here except we grab the friggin' fragment we want from the fragment manager, and that's basically it. So as you can see, once people started to really strip the activities down more and more to the point where they barely have any code in them, after a certain point, we started to figure out, well, what if we just had like one root activity and then multiple different fragments? And that makes sense from a code to eliminate redundant code. It's better separation of concerns because, in my opinion, the activity class never really... I shouldn't say it like that. I never recommended people to use activities as views unless it's a special situation where it's simple enough that it doesn't pose a problem with testing and blah, blah, blah. So anyways, what I'm going to say here is that you can try to do single activity, and currently, unless you run into the ugly situations which the navigation library doesn't sort of deal with properly, you're probably going to want to use the navigation library to set that up. Like I say, I have a big tutorial on that. Now, with that being said, a lot of people are really excited, like I said, about going single activity, but it's important to understand that if you run into a situation where you can't do single activity, that's okay. Get rid of as many redundant activities as possible, but don't cause a whole bunch of problems for yourself because you're trying to figure out some workaround about how to get this thing to work even though it's not working nicely with the navigation library. So like I said, the best example of that for me was on activity result callbacks just not really being handled at all. So do try to go for single activity, but if you can't, that's totally fine too. So anyways, all right, so I see we got a couple follow-up questions here. So let me get to your question in a minute, Konstantinos. I haven't actually looked at mediator live data or switch map. My intuition about it is that that's probably going to be useful if you want to use basically live data in your back end. Maybe there are some limited use cases where you might want to use it in the front end, but I don't actually, as a rule, use live data or Android APIs in my back end, except for like Room or something like that. I don't use them as the mechanism for asynchrony and communication. I prefer to use coroutines in the middle layer and back end of my application. Anyways, what I'll do is I'll maybe try and look at mediator live data and see what it does, but let me just look at some other questions here. Okay. So, what's up, Toby? Okay, so by the way, Toby, thank you so much for your support over all this time. Much appreciated. Okay, so Toby asks, what's the reasoning behind creating an activity? So this is kind of on the same topic here. Creating an activity and then adding a single fragment. So the reason why I would do that is because if I have my activity which has the responsibility or the concern of being a container, it should not also manage the user interface. So the argument for decoupling the UI from the activity into a fragment is separation of concerns. So what does that actually do? So there's a couple things going on here. So part of the deal is that because the activity has such a fragile life cycle, that's kind of an argument to separate out the view immediately. If you're like me and you rigorously apply separation of concerns, so you pull these things out like that, what you'll find is, especially in larger applications, your code will become easy to change, easy to improve, easy to understand. So a lot of people will see this behavior of like decoupling everything. People say model view presenter, separate it out, clean architecture, separate everything out. The reason why we do this is that ultimately, if you start to build larger applications, you will see that there's so many different benefits to actually doing that. So what I'm saying here is that the question was specifically like, why create an activity and then add a single fragment? Simply because I don't want the activity to have the responsibility of being both a container for the other components in the application. So that could be the presenter, the view model, even the backend. I lost my train of thought. And also a view. And a view is a class which is responsible for like binding data to the user interface type thing. So that's kind of the general answer there. Mr. Hoon. By the way, Mr. Hoon, if I'm curious, you don't have to answer, but what year were you born? Anyways, so Mr. Hoon asks, please recommend how to night mode an app. I've never done that before, so I can't answer that question for you. I'm getting really... This is... it's funny, like, when I do these live streams, for example, like, last live stream I did, all we did was answer questions, and I was, like, on fire answering them. And then today, these are all, like, questions that I either have barely know about, or the code I have written that works with them is like 3 years old and stuff. So I'm sorry, I'm failing pretty hard today, but you know, just got to keep on trucking. So there's one I can't answer from I'm gonna call you Eddie. And then maybe we can look at that sealed class. Okay, so Eddie asks, can I explain how to handle events with sealed classes and view model? Absolutely. So I'll show you how I approach this problem. So for each feature in my application, and when I say feature, I'm talking about like a primary UI screen. So maybe we have like note list feature, note detail feature, login feature, that kind of thing. For each feature, if you check out code in the description box below, Jetpack notes, you'll notice that in each of these things I'll have an event class. So in here in note list, it's note list event. In note detail feature, it's note detail event. So when I open up one of these classes, you will find a sealed class. So how these sealed classes kind of work is when you want data out of them, you're going to make them a data class. When you don't care about the particular data, you just want to publish some kind of event, then you can use an object. Okay, so this is that's the sealed class. Now, how do we actually use it? So how I like to set this up is I do like to use live data in the front end of my application, the front end Android module. So I don't recommend live data for middle and back end stuff, but for front end, it's friggin' awesome because it's lifecycle aware. So what I like to do is basically anytime in my recent applications, when we have a situation where we have a view calling back to a view model, or it could be a view calling back to a presenter, or it could be my adapter calling back to my view. I do it there too. I basically will have, let me show you the, let's show you the adapter, and this will be kind of my first example. So in this application, I have a Recyclerview Adapter. And so how we used to handle communicating between like an adapter and a fragment is we would have an interface, or how I used to, I should say. I keep saying we. I would have an interface which was basically just a reference to the view. I've gotten rid of that interface, and what I do now is this list adapter holds on to its own mutable live data object here. Notice how the type of this mutable live data object in here, the value type that it holds, is note list event. So this is just another one of those sealed class events, event sealed classes. So how do we actually use this thing? So we need to use mutable live data, because if we use live data, we can't change it here, and we want to be able to change it when we want. So what we do is we set this property up, event, and then when someone clicks a button in the recycler view, we say event.value, which is referring to this property up here, and value is referring to whatever the mutable live data object is wrapping. We change it. So we just say equals whatever event occurred. So in this case, when someone clicks on the recycler view, we say on note item click, and then we also pass the position of the item which was clicked. This is going to propagate into the note list view, and where the note list view handles this particular event is down here. So the view in this case listens to the adapter by saying adapter.event. So that's talking to my adapter disappeared. Why did it disappear? There we go. So that's talking to this object here. It's getting a hook to observe our mutable live data. And then any time that an event occurs and we set the live data, it pops up here as a note list event object. Then what I do is I just forward whatever event occurred to the view model. When I open up the view model, note list view model, that's not it, note list view model, there we go. When I open up the view model, all of my view models have this handle event function, and it always accepts some kind of sealed class. And then this is how we actually kind of decide what to do once we receive our sealed class. So, for example, if someone hits the, if the feature just starts up and everything's set up, then we want to request notes from the backend and display them. If the user clicks on a particular note item, then that means that we want to edit that item. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. So the general process here, and you can do this in the backend too, but what you want to do is for each kind of feature of your application or whatever you're doing, set up a sealed class which represents all these different potential events, and then set up some kind of single entry point in the whatever class is supposed to be receiving and handling the events. So one thing I do here is for all of my view model objects, they extend this class called base view model, which is something I have created. And in the base view model class, notice how it accepts a generic type here. And then we have this abstract fun handle event. When I want to actually specify what this type should be, then I just kind of include that in the signature up here. So note list view model extends base view model. I specify the type of event sealed class that I want to be handling in this particular view model, and then we override that handle event function, and everything works fantastic. So that's how I handle events with sealed classes. So anyways, there's other ways you can do that. So there is like Kotlin Delegates by Observable. I tried to use that in the front end, but it didn't end up being any easier or safer than using live data. You could also, one thing I'll do very commonly is the thing that I return from like the back end of my application will be some kind of result wrapper. So let's see what a result wrapper looks like. So a result wrapper, again, we have basically a sealed class, and then it has like value, which means success. I should probably just change it to success, but whatever. And Then we have an error value, which it might potentially contain. And so anytime I call some function on the back end, what I'll do is I'll use this convenient build function, and I'll either try to get a value out of whatever function call. Say this could be like, let me show you an example. Let's look at, is this, no, that's not the one. Firebase, no, repo. So anytime I'm calling some function on a backend class, I'm calling this result.build convenience function, which is this thing here. And then I just basically wrap whatever call might be successful or might fail in this handy function, extension function. And yeah, and then it'll spit out either a value or an error. So this is kind of a handy little trick as well. All right. Let's see here. So I'm going to call it a day pretty quick because I actually have to hit the gym pretty soon. So, okay. I found out that Mr. Hoon was born in 98, so that means you are Hoon Dong-seng. And if anyone's wondering about that, that's Korean. I was wondering if I had to call you Hyung. Definitely not. I was born in 93. All right. So, what do we have here? Mr. Hoon asks, have I ever tried creating an Android library? Any idea how to create one? So, yeah, I haven't really. It's one of those things where. So as far as like the technical side of like packaging your application and stuff like that, I don't have much experience in doing that. But in a sense, it's actually kind of easier to. It's not actually that difficult to make a library, depending on what you're trying to do. Now, I don't. And it totally depends on that, just like if you're building an application. But I've actually thought about building certain libraries for views, in particular just some compound views and stuff like that. But I've never actually published anything, so I don't really have any great tips for that. One of the things you can kind of do is if I go to like File, New, or what it would be, we'll go to File, Project Structure. You can, let's say you opened up your a new project or something like that. You can create a new module, and then you could do a thing where you could pick, so for example, Android library or something like that, or Java library or something. And so that's going to be like slightly different, and yeah, there's some options in Android Studio for you to construct kind of something which isn't actually meant to be like deployed as an actual phone application. But again, you've managed to pick another thing that I don't really have much experience in. So anyways, I'm going to stick around for another 2 minutes maybe, and if there's any, maybe I'll try and answer one more question, but that's basically it. So on a completely off-topic note, because I don't immediately have a question to answer here, so I used to live with a South Korean exchange student, and so that's why I'm always giving Mr. Hoon a bunch of trouble here, and why I asked him when he was born, because something which is totally different in Korean culture, South Korean, obviously, is, and I guess this is true of a lot of different Asian cultures, is that the year you're born is like quite socially important. So for example, I asked Mr. Hoon how old he was. Since he's younger than me, he was born in 98, I would call him Hun Dongseng, which means like junior or something like. His name is. I guess I wouldn't pronounce the Hun. It would be like Un Dongseng. And if someone's older than you and it's a guy, I would have to call them Hyung. And then if they're the same age as me, I would have to call them Chingu. And then there's a whole other bunch of words for if someone's female and they're older than you, same age. I think same age is still Chingu. And then younger, I think younger is like Namdongseng or something. No, that's for a guy. So anyways, it's just really funny. When I was learning a little bit of Korean, I had to learn all of these different titles, for lack of a better, I think honorifics is the appropriate term, for ages and genders and all this stuff. And we totally don't have any of that in English, like very little. And on the other side of things, I won't talk for too much longer here, but this Korean exchange student, when he came to Canada, it really surprised him that, for example, in the high school I went to, there was a couple teachers who you would actually just call them by their last name. And so I guess the idea of like walking up to like a teacher in many Asian cultures and just being like, oh, hey, Doug, instead of saying like, I'll try not to say the actual name here, but, oh, hey, like Mr. Peterson or a teacher or something like that. You just walk up to your teacher and just address them by the first name. That's actually pretty common here in Canada because we're not big on just like rigid social hierarchies at all. And I actually prefer it that way because I met a lot of people who are older than me but don't really deserve respect. And what I mean by that is if they're very disrespectful to me, I don't really tolerate that from anybody. But I don't go around being disrespectful. I try to always start by being respectful. Anyways, I don't know what the hell I was talking about there, just totally rambling, but I think I'm going to call it a day there. So for everyone who's watching, next live stream before you go is going to be a special episode where I'm going to be taking questions about the production, content creation, editing, search engine optimization, all those kinds of things that I deal with here in wiseAss, marketing, basically non-technical topics. So if you're curious about any of that stuff and you're curious about how I do the things I do at wiseAss, what programs I use for editing and all that kind of stuff, then do consider joining me next weekend and I'll be going over that. Anyways, pretty crappy episode today. I don't really feel like I answered a single question very well, but you know, I could lie, but I'm not going to do that. And, you know, some days I just get questions that I don't have direct experience with. I've never worked with night mode. Last time I worked with Location Manager was in 2016. I've never actually had to build a service, even though I probably, that's something I'll learn shortly. So yeah, anyways, it is what it is. Thank you so much for watching, and peace out.